Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through complex information, pulling out the key knowledge and those surprising insights just for you. Today we're diving into a pretty startling event involving Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram. Our main source is a really compelling interview where Durov himself recounts his experience, basically being arrested in France. So, our mission here is to unpack this whole thing. What were the actual circumstances? What reasons were given versus, his side of the story? And maybe the bigger question, what might this tell us about technology, privacy, and government power, especially in the West? We've got his personal account, the details, the wider context he brings up. Let's jump into the sources.
Okay, so maybe start right at the beginning. What exactly happened when Durov got to Paris last August?
Right, so picture this. August 2024, he flies into Paris. He says it was purely for tourism, like a short holiday before heading up to Finland. No business meetings planned. But instead of, breezing through customs, he's met by police officers right there at the airport.
Definitely not the usual welcome. How did he react? Confusion, mostly. Initially, he apparently thought, maybe it's some extra security checks. With the Olympics and Paralympics coming up, he even mentioned trying to calm down his girlfriend who was with him, telling her something like, "Don't worry, it's France, it's fine." Which, looking back...
Yeah, quite the irony there.
Yeah.
And then came the charges.
Yes, they read him this list. He said it was around 16 different charges covering various alleged crimes. And that just deepened his confusion because, from his perspective, these weren't things he had personally done.
Right, it wasn't about his own actions, but about the platform itself.
That seems to be the realization he quickly hit upon. Telegram has 1 billion users. He figured the charges must relate to things other people might have done using the app. As he said, he obviously doesn't know all billion users personally.
And the way they detained him was, dramatic.
Yeah, put him in a car, police motorcades, sirens, the whole thing. He actually points out the irony comparing it to the motorcades he'd gotten when visiting heads of state elsewhere. Quite a different context.
And the very first thing they did was...
took his phone... right there, immediately after greeting him. That cut him off instantly. He said he just managed to quickly tell his assistant to find lawyers, contact friends, try and figure out what on earth was happening.
And how long was he actually held like that?
4 days. He spent 4 days in police custody. He described the place as some building in South Paris, apparently run by customs police.
Okay, and the conditions.
Yeah.
The source material had some pretty vivid descriptions.
Yeah, that was quite striking. He basically called it solitary confinement, even if that wasn't the official legal term. He detailed the cell. Maybe 7 square meters, so 70 square feet, just a concrete block, no windows. The bed was just this thin mattress, like maybe a centimeter thick. He compared it to a yoga mat. No sheets, no pillow. Plus a constantly blinking light, which he said was incredibly annoying. And the door locked securely, obviously.
So not technically a prison, but it sounds pretty grim. 4 days cut off.
That's exactly how he described it. Held for 4 days, no outside contact in those conditions.
Yeah, solitary confinement is the term he used for the experience.
Okay, so that covers the arrest itself, the detention. Pretty shocking stuff. Let's pivot to the why. What was the stated reason? French authorities were apparently concerned about Telegram's responses, or lack thereof.
That was the official line, yes. An alleged lack of response from Telegram to judicial requests from France.
But Durov really pushes back on that, doesn't he?
He does, quite strongly. His claim is pretty direct. Telegram never received a single legally binding request from France that they didn't address. He questions why they didn't just follow the standard European procedures like under the Digital Services Act, the DSA, or even just use Telegram's own public process for these things. It's right there on their website in their privacy policy.
So wait, Telegram does have a system for cooperating. They don't just ignore all government requests. No, not at all, according to him. He explains they do respond to legally binding court orders signed by a judge, but it's specifically for identification, data, IP address, phone number of criminal suspects, not content. And this process, he says, was handled through a company they set up in Belgium, and it had been working fine. Other European countries were apparently using it successfully for a whole year before his arrest.
And the key point from his perspective is that France just didn't use it.
Exactly. According to Durov, France completely bypassed this established channel. He seemed genuinely baffled by it, wondering why they wouldn't use their own legal framework and Telegram's stated process.
And let's be clear on the scope here. This compliance is only for identification data, right? Not private messages.
Absolutely crucial point. He stresses that. Compliance is limited to that specific ID data required by the DSA, never private messages or user activity. He even says Telegram technically can't access private messages because of end-to-end encryption and secret chats and client-server encryption elsewhere, even if they wanted to. And the law doesn't demand it.
And providing this kind of ID data with a proper court order, that's actually standard practice under EU law now.
Yes, he described it as basically standard procedure for social media companies in Europe under the DSA. In fact, he points out if platforms don't comply with these valid, legally binding requests for identification data, they face huge fines, potentially even being blocked in the EU.
Okay, so given that context, the existing process, the standard practices,
Yeah.
his reaction of shock makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, total shock. He said initially he thought, this must be a mistake. They've got the wrong guy. The reality only hit him when, well, they didn't let him go.
And it's not like he's just anybody.
Yeah.
CEO, owner, multi-billion-dollar company, 1 billion users.
Exactly. He emphasizes that. An airport arrest like this on these kinds of grounds, for a tech CEO of his profile, he called it unprecedented. Outrageous was his word.
And adding another layer of complexity, he's actually a French citizen.
Right. He specifically mentioned he went through the whole multi-year process, passed the exams, got French citizenship. He even talks about genuinely loving France, its culture.
Which you'd think would make contacting him extremely easy for French authorities if they had legitimate concerns.
Absolutely. That's his point. His French address is in his passport. Easy to find. Plus, get this, the French consulate in Dubai. It's in the same building as the Telegram office, just 2 floors down. He said he was there frequently. French agencies had set up meetings with him before through normal channels. No problem.
So the narrative that they had to arrest him at the airport because they couldn't reach him, that seems, well, thin based on those facts.
He certainly believes the situation could have and should have been handled very differently, less drastically, less publicly.
Speaking of public, the sources mention the prosecutor's office being unusually vocal about it.
Yes, according to his French lawyers, it was highly unusual for the prosecutor's office to issue press statements like they did about his arrest. Durov's interpretation. It felt like a deliberate attempt to humiliate him, maybe even scare him. He shared this chilling detail. While he was in custody, a policeman apparently told him newspapers were covering it, but writing everything but the truth. Imagine hearing that while locked up and cut off. He said it really freaked him out.
And being cut off from family must have been incredibly stressful.
He said that was the absolute hardest part, being unable to contact his family. He mentioned being especially worried about his elderly mother who's ill and his kids back in Dubai. Understandably, his family was just shocked, confused, and extremely worried when the news broke.
Now, this whole incident in France, it gains another dimension when you consider Durov's personal history, especially with Russia.
It really does. He's quite famous for his backstory with Russia, right? Being essentially forced out after refusing to cooperate with the government over his previous platform, vContact, specifically refusing to hand over user data. And the powerful point he makes is, despite all that conflict, even Putin's government never arrested him.
So the irony of being arrested in the West, in France, is pretty stark for him.
He definitely highlights that irony, getting arrested in the Free West, as it's often called, after visiting and operating in countries sometimes labeled authoritarian, where Telegram is huge, and having no such issues. Precisely because, he argues, Telegram maintains this strict stance on user privacy and against political censorship.
And he contrasts Telegram's model with other big tech companies, too.
Right. He draws a clear line between Telegram and companies like, say, Meta, which make their money primarily by mining user data for targeted ads. Telegram, he insists, just doesn't do that. It's fundamental to their approach.
So how do they make money then, if they're not using personal data like that?
He says they've developed voluntary ways, things like paid subscriptions for extra features, which users actively choose to buy. And apparently it's working. He mentioned Telegram became profitable last year, making over $500 million, all while sticking to their privacy principles. Okay, so pulling this together, the motivation behind this very public French arrest becomes the big question. The source material floats speculation from a sort of bystander view that maybe it wasn't just about those alleged non-responses. Maybe the public humiliation was an attempt to pressure him, to intimidate him into providing some kind of backdoor access for surveillance.
Possibly driven by government fears about, say, domestic dissent being organized privately?
That's the kind of speculation presented. Because Telegram offers strong privacy, it can make it harder for governments to monitor certain communications, which some might see as a threat, especially if they're worried about internal unrest. Durov himself says no one directly asked him for keys. He notes that those kinds of master keys don't really exist anyway, but he absolutely acknowledges that governments consistently push for backdoors into encrypted systems.
And he's pointed to the U.S. as an example of this pressure before, right?
Yes, he specifically mentioned the U.S. system where apparently engineers can be served secret court orders with gag orders, forcing them to build vulnerabilities into systems without even telling their bosses. He stated that this specific risk was a major factor in his decision years ago not to base Telegram's development team in the U.S. And if you look at the broader European context, this fits a pattern. The source mentions a recent French Senate attempt, although it failed in the National Assembly, to effectively ban strong encryption and mandate backdoors. Plus, there's apparently a new EU-level project aiming for something similar.
And Durov's counter-argument is that forcing these backdoors actually makes everyone less safe.
Precisely. He argues it's not just a privacy issue. Mandated backdoors create weaknesses that hackers, criminals, even foreign spies can exploit, putting millions of ordinary users at risk. His point is that the actual bad actors would just switch to other secure apps or VPNs anyway, leaving law-abiding citizens exposed. He makes the interesting observation that no country, not even the most authoritarian ones, has actually managed to successfully ban encryption entirely, partly because they recognize these huge security risks. He also noted the French public seemed largely unaware of that recent anti-encryption law attempt. This connects to his critique of aspects of the DSA, the Digital Services Act. He highlighted how it allows one EU country to demand content takedowns across the entire EU very quickly, with appeals being slow and difficult.
And he drew a rather pointed historical parallel there.
He did, yeah. He compared it quite provocatively to the Warsaw Pact, or the old Soviet system. This idea of, quote, unelected foreigners making sweeping decisions with limited transparency or recourse.
Amidst all this, how does he position Telegram itself?
As a neutral platform. He emphasizes that Telegram doesn't algorithmically push channels or content. Users have to actively seek out and subscribe to channels. He believes this model allows for a wide range of voices, within basic rules against violence and hate speech, obviously, and lets users decide for themselves what makes sense. He calls this freedom, but acknowledges it gets pushback.
And he sees the action France took against him as ultimately damaging to France itself.
Yeah, he used the term friendly fire. Like French authorities were attacking a potential ally, someone who does cooperate against actual crime when proper legal process is followed. He argues it caused huge collateral damage, not just to him and Telegram, but to France's image in the global tech world. He mentioned other tech CEOs are now wary about their own safety or their company's operations if they visit France.
Which loops back to why he chose France initially.
Exactly. He said he chose French citizenship specifically because of the ideals liberty, equality, fraternity. He saw Western Europe as upholding freedoms, especially compared to his past experiences. He shared this really striking moment from his detention. An interpreter, who was originally from the Soviet Union, apparently told him, "The Soviet Union has caught up with me," right there in France. His reflection is that maybe people born into free societies take those freedoms for granted, don't always see how they can be gradually eroded, and the justifications used today protecting kids, fighting crime, he sees parallels to how authoritarian regimes historically justified clamping down on freedoms.
Okay, so fast forward to now, roughly 8 months later. Where does the investigation stand today?
Well, as of the interview date, which was around June 2025, he's still effectively based in France. He's under judicial control, meaning his travel is limited. He can apparently travel to Dubai sometimes, but under restricted conditions.
Which she finds confusing, unnecessary.
Yeah, extremely strange and unnecessary from his perspective. He pointed out he's only needed for questioning maybe every few months, so why the severe travel restriction? He argues it really hinders his ability to run Telegram, with 99.5% of users outside France. And it impacts his personal life, seeing his kids, caring for his sick mother in Dubai.
And the actual claim against him now? Has it shifted from the initial lack of response issue?
He seemed to still be trying to pin down the exact legal basis, but said it appears to revolve around this idea that he personally didn't do enough to stop criminals from using Telegram, which he argues is conceptually flawed. He uses that analogy again like arresting a head of state because crimes happened in their country and they didn't prevent every single one.
What about the pace of the whole process?
Slow. He described it as, traditionally French in that regard. It hasn't been fast-tracked or anything. His current status is still under investigation. They're deciding if there's even enough evidence to go to trial. He's not actually on trial yet. So the future is still pretty uncertain. He acknowledged that, criminal charges are a possibility. Everything is possible, he said. If it does go to trial, he anticipates it could take years. But he expressed hope, maybe even expectation, that he'll be able to travel freely later this year. He'd be very surprised, he said, if they forced him to live in France permanently for the whole duration.
And his phone, the one they took at the airport.
Still with the French authorities, apparently. He actually expressed a hope that they do examine it thoroughly. He believes it contains evidence backing up Telegram's legitimacy and their compliance efforts over the last decade.
Beyond his own immediate situation, Durov also shared some broader thoughts, didn't he? On where things are heading with technology, privacy, control.
He did. He talked about encryption needing to evolve, with things like quantum computing on the horizon. We'll need quantum secure encryption. He also raised the unsettling possibility that state actors might already have undisclosed tech, near infinite computing power that we just don't know about.
From his insider perspective, then, what's the biggest privacy risk we face right now?
He thinks it's state actors using zero-day vulnerabilities, those hidden software flaws to secretly hack into people's devices. He mentioned he himself was targeted by the Pegasus spyware years ago, and he suspects many people are affected by similar things today without realizing it. He did add that while you can't be certain, there are ways to check for known exploits.
And this informed view leads him to make a pretty stark personal choice about phones.
Yeah, he says he doesn't really use a phone regularly. Didn't carry a SIM even before they took his phone, doesn't carry one now. He finds them distracting for deep work, sure, but also sees them as a major potential privacy liability. Prefers laptops, iPads for focus. And that's not just a quirk, right? It comes from someone who built this stuff, who understands the risks at a deep level. Connecting this back to the theme of control, he reflected on cases like Ross Ulbricht, the Silk Road founder, who got a very harsh sentence. He suggests that building technology which makes it harder for governments to control people can, put a target on your back. He observed that often people like interior ministers or police chiefs see strong encryption mainly as an obstacle to solving crime. His take wasn't necessarily a grand conspiracy, but more that officials tend to use the tools and pressures available to them to increase control, sometimes without fully considering the broader negative impacts on freedom or other aspects of society.
Despite everything, he ended on a note of gratitude, though.
He did, yes. Expressed thanks even after detailing this incredibly difficult experience.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a story we've unpacked from the sources. Arriving for tourism, ending up detained for days, and now living under travel restrictions, all tangled up in running a global platform like Telegram.
It really shows how a legal issue, or an alleged legal issue, can spiral into something touching on really fundamental questions about personal liberty, how countries interact, and what digital privacy even means anymore.
The sources gave us those vivid, almost surreal details of his arrest and detention. We heard his side, why he believes the official reasons don't hold up against Telegram's actual practices, and why he sees the whole thing as unprecedented, maybe even politically motivated.
And we explored those bigger themes he raised. The constant push for backdoors across Europe, the real risks of government surveillance tools like Pegasus, and those historical echoes he perceives in how restrictions on freedom are justified today.
So the question for you listening is, what does an event like this really signify?
Yeah, think about it. In this world, saturated with information, with constant debates about security versus freedom, what does Pavel Durov's experience suggest about where power really lies in our digital lives? And how much real control do any of us have?
Keep exploring, keep questioning, always look for those deeper insights.